You are my queen. You are my queen. You are my queen. Daenerys is our queen. She is our queen. She'll be a good queen. She is my queen.
With House of the Dragon releasing this month, recently I decided to binge watch the entirety of Game of Thrones again for the first time in a few years to freshen myself up on all things Westeros. And to sort of get me in the mood for House of the Dragon, as the trailers we'd seen so far, it actually looked pretty good. And it had been some time since I'd last seen Game of Thrones. Now, for context for this video, I jumped on the Game of Thrones bandwagon around season 4 and I watched it as it came out ever since. And upon rewatch, I'd say it changed the show for me forever. Going back through the show with context on where this story and its characters end up, for better and worse, mostly worse, I had never enjoyed the first half of the show more, and I'd never hated the second half of the show more. To be fair, 99.9% of that hatred does come from season 8. Like, seriously, what were these two doing? So after I'd done my rewatch and threw every item within my reach at my TV after my boy Jaime Lannister had his entire arc thrown in the bin, I decided that I wanted to make a massive video on this channel talking about Game of Thrones, its downfall, the season 8 blasphemy that seems to just age worse and worse as the years go by, because I have so much to say on the rise and fall of Game of Thrones, and the video essay on Prey that I released a couple of weeks ago seemed to go over really well, so I figured, let's do this for Game of Thrones and discuss the rise and fall of Game of Thrones, the triumph and destruction of this once pinnacle of television. And what better time than now that we're jumping back into things with House of the Dragon. So I'm going to break the video up into 3 sections because I feel like Game of Thrones as a series is split into 3 sections. The masterpiece that is seasons 1 to 4, and then seasons 5 and 6, which was when the show started to go a little bit wrong. And then seasons 7 and 8, the complete destruction of Game of Thrones.
I will hurt you for this. A day will come when you think you're safe and happy, and your joy will turn to ashes in your mouth.
The first time I watched Game of Thrones, I was always in complete awe at just how the show managed to juggle all of these storylines with all of these characters. The Lannisters in King's Landing, Arya's adventures, Daenerys gaining power and armies in Essos, Jon's time on the wall, Jaime and Brienne's journey back to King's Landing, and the list goes on and on and on. Never had I seen a show that had so much purpose to each and every scene. Each and every line of dialogue just seemed to have so much care and thought put into it. The characters all had their own unique wants and allegiances, and it was so much fun to just see the plotting, the scheming, the Game of Thrones take place right in front of you. Where the f did that go? But the politics of this show were just so well done in its earlier seasons, and of course there were the big battle episodes like Blackwater, Watchers on the Wall. But the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones didn't rely on these big battle episodes like the later seasons did to be good. I still think the best episode of Game of Thrones takes place in season 4 with the laws of gods and men. Seeing Tyrion stand up for himself in his trial despite Jaime giving him a way out was just so satisfying, even more so upon rewatch. Peter Dinklage just took it to the next level. Jaime and Tyrion, they are my 2 favorite characters, so naturally any Lannister heavy episode is a dub in my book. And I do think that season 4 of Game of Thrones in general is just the best season. Like, just in season 4 we get the Purple Wedding, Tyrion's trial, Tyrion killing Tywin on the shitter, this sadistic bastard, Oberyn in the mountain, and the epic wildling battle on the wall. Like, what a season. And I've got to say, Charles Dance as Tywin is some of the best casting I've ever seen in a TV series. This guy chews up every single scene he is in and stands out so much in a season where Peter Dinklage just went to another level as well. Tywin just has so much power over every person he's in a room with, regardless of rank. The scene where he basically just tells Joffrey, the king, to go to bed is just the best.
I'm not tired.
Now, even though this time round was a rewatch, I just wanted to watch the first 4 seasons in one sitting. I literally could not stop watching episode after episode, even though I'd already seen the show before. Season 1 just set the precedent. Some of the best scenes of the show aren't its big moments, it's the smaller moments. The conversations between these larger-than-life characters. I still think Robert Baratheon's conversation with Cersei is one of the best scenes in the entire first season. If not, dare I say it, the entire show. And all they do is talk about their marriage and Lyanna Stark. That's it. That's the power that Game of Thrones used to have. And also any scene that Littlefinger and Varys had together, I could watch those two conniving little shits backhand compliment each other all day. It was just great television that's still so rewatchable to this day. Now, I of course can't touch on the first season of Game of Thrones without mentioning Ned Stark. I feel for Sean Bean, he just dies in everything. And although I jumped on the show around the time season 4 came out, I managed to dodge Ned's death, so when it happened, my jaw was on the floor. How dare they kill such an important character? Little did I know what was to come. But season 1 in its simplest form was just a murder mystery. Who killed Jon Arryn and why? But it just sprawled off into a million directions without ever losing itself, and the next 3 seasons followed suit. Did the show have a lot going on in its earlier seasons? Yes, but it never felt overwhelming. The main plot and all the accompanying side plots had engaging characters. I say all loosely because even the earlier seasons Bran is still kind of meh, but considering what comes in the second half of the show with Bran, it's a masterpiece in comparison.
I'm going to go now.
Fuck off.
The characters like Tyrion in the earlier seasons just never failed to surprise me with just how intelligent he could be, how sympathetic he was despite being so deeply flawed. And that's another reason why I love Jaime Lannister in this show so much, because apart from the whole going to Pound Town on his sister thing, he's the only Lannister that ever actually treated Tyrion like a human. I guess you guys are starting to pick up on why Tyrion and Jaime are my 2 favorite characters in the show. And I mean, we all know where they end up in season 8, so don't worry, you will witness my mental breakdown firsthand, I promise. But as the seasons of the show progressed, the show just never failed to introduce new characters that seemingly just slotted into the show perfectly. I say this because when Euron Greyjoy shows up in the later seasons, the dude stuck out like a sore thumb and I just wanted him dead the entire time. Also, some of my favorite times in the first 4 seasons actually took place beyond the wall. I promise I'm not a soppy twat, but Jon and Ygritte's relationship created one of the best dynamics of the show, and it really was Game of Thrones at its peak at that point. The conflict it brought to Jon's character made me like Jon 10 times more than I did in the first season. And Ygritte's death was one of the better scenes of the show for me, and it really set Jon's character in motion. But what never failed to hit home in season 4 was those big moments that the show did eventually become famous for. The important character deaths, the notion that nobody is safe because plot armor does not exist in Game of Thrones, at least in the first half of the show. We'll get to that as well, don't worry. The Red Wedding is still one of the most harrowing scenes I have ever seen in any TV show or film. The execution of it, the tone, the writing, the easing of reins of Castamere as Catelyn starts to realize that something is wrong. It is just perfect. And I absolutely love Robert Madden's reaction to the Red Wedding, that after he shot his death scene, he had to get on a flight, so he just went to the airport still covered in blood. Like, what an absolute Chad. Now, I want to wrap up the first segment of this video because let's be real, the rest of the video is going to be a lot more fun. But the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, in my opinion, is the best block of television in history. I don't think much comes close to the first 4 seasons condensed into its own little story. The various plot lines, the world building, the character work, the spectacle, the climax episodes, the dialogue, and man, some of the lines in this show were just incredible. Seasons 1 to 4 of Game of Thrones are just a straight up triumph of television, and it was fun while it lasted.
You want a good girl, but you need a bad pussy.
You serious?
Now, a lot of people are pretty much under the spell that season 8 of Game of Thrones is the only reason as to why the show ultimately failed. As great as those first 4 seasons were, what came after was an obvious decline in quality that started in season 5. That's when Game of Thrones began to lose its way and it all culminated into the shit show that was season 8. Conveniently, season 5 was when the writers of the show, these 2 absolute big brain geniuses, had the multiple flaws in their skills as writers put on display, because they were running out of the source material that made the show what it was in seasons 1 to 4. Without George R.R. Martin, they had nowhere left to hide. They had to fill in the gaps. They had to complete the arcs that George's work set up. When they ran out of source material, the show slowly started running out of steam, and it was really, really obvious. Now don't get it twisted, season 5 and season 6 of Game of Thrones overall are still pretty good seasons of television, but they are a far cry from seasons 1 to 4. They're still very enjoyable, but the flaws are there for everyone to see. Season 5 really did have a lot of red flags. Now don't get me wrong, season 5 also had a lot of great moments. Cersei's walk of shame, Dany meeting Tyrion, Dany riding Drogon, Jon's death, Theon rescuing Sansa, and Hardhome. I loved all of those things, and it was those moments that kept me engaged in the show. But the show had issues in season 5. Nothing catastrophic like season 8, but the red flags were everywhere. Like Sir Barristan, he died because, well, reasons. Even though he could have played into the Mad Queen arc in later seasons, but no, just dead. Again, because reasons. The scene where Barristan dies could be torn out of the show entirely and nothing would change. It exists to have some action and for a character to die for no reason. Characters in this show don't die for no reason. That's not how the first 4 seasons of the show operated. Every death we had in those first 4 seasons meant something. It drove the story forward. It sent the characters forward. But here, it was like the writers knew that they couldn't rely on the writing and George's dialogue anymore, so they just threw this in here to keep people believing that the show was still prepared to kill off its major characters, but they missed the point entirely. Another red flag, Littlefinger. Littlefinger takes Sansa to Ramsay. Like, yeah, sure, piss off the one person who saw you murder Lady Arryn then lied to defend you. All just to align yourself with the Boltons, who don't have the Lannisters backing anymore because Tywin's dead and the North hates them. This character inconsistency on Littlefinger's part sets the seed for his death in season 7, but the fact that Littlefinger's death is rooted in a writing oversight is really frustrating. Also, the High Sparrow, the Faith, was just meh. Granted, the conclusion of that storyline is actually pretty climactic and great to watch, admittedly, but this was just not the slice of King's Landing enjoyment that I'd normally get from this show. As for Stannis Baratheon, he had a pretty anticlimactic end, at least in my opinion. He just lingers around the Watch for a while, burns his daughter to death, which admittedly was actually pretty awesome. That makes me sound really, really bad. But that did give me a little bit of hope that not all was lost with character deaths in this show. But then Stannis just kinda pieces out and dies. I just wanted more from Stannis, as this character had been building for so long and it was just an anticlimax. And plenty of other characters in season 5 kind of just sit around as well, like Brienne just chills and waits for a signal to help Sansa. Tyrion just monologues to himself while Jorah looks into the distance. Like, it felt like a lot of characters were just kind of stuck in limbo. It was just becoming blatantly clear that D&D didn't know how to balance all of these characters. Having said that, I do need to talk about Hardhome. Yeah, the plot armor, which becomes very, very commonplace in the further seasons, started in this episode. But it's pretty awesome to watch it play out, let's be honest. Hardhome is a banger of an action episode. I loved the Night King's look in this season as well, and when he raises the dead, it is just chef's kiss. But that leads me on to my last major gripe with season 5, and that is Jon's death. At face value, I love the scene, and it absolutely made me believe that this show was actually returning to its roots once again. But then 2 episodes later, he's revived. Game of Thrones has always had shock value, but there was one thing that it always had: purpose. And they lost that once they ran out of George's material. So season 5 was when it started to go wrong for sure, and season 6 basically just done the same thing. Arya's Braavos storyline ended up being kind of lame. Euron showing up was just... oh, Euron. Don't worry, we'll talk about Euron later.
A finger in the bum.
Fuck off.
And the smaller moments where characters go for a walk side by side, a trademark of sorts for the earlier seasons, where the dialogue was always on point. But here, Tyrion just keeps talking about Varys not having a dick. Like, okay. You've got the waif shanking Arya like 4 times and her somehow surviving, then Arya just ends up killing her. And then she goes and leaves the faceless man, and it's kind of like, alright, the show's smaller moments are definitely not hitting like they used to. Yes, Arya ends up getting revenge on Walder Frey at the end of the season, which was good, but Arya's conclusion in Braavos was a bit of an L. And I mean, Rickon just appeared again and then died. Seriously, what is the deal with Rickon in this show? He's a Stark, but he's just on the sidelines for the entire show. And Battle of the Bastards, whilst it's a masterpiece in some aspects, and in terms of filmmaking, it is absolutely phenomenal what they were able to do, but it's incredibly flawed at the same time. The plot armor of Jon is at an all-time high here. It's actually a little bit ridiculous. And then we've got Sansa just not telling Jon that she's had the support of the Night's Vale just so there could be this epic savior moment. It's like, yep, cheers Sansa, could have used that information beforehand. As for the good, the reveal of Jon being a Targaryen, great. Majority of the Battle of the Bastards, great. The set of Baelor explosion, great. But a little bit flawed. It's basically just to get Cersei on the throne, get Tommen out of the way, and yeet most of the Tyrells out of the show. Having said that, the way the scene was done, how it was edited, how it was shot and built through the sound department is simply incredible. My issues with it are due to what comes after, much like Jon's death in season 5. The scene in isolation is absolutely perfect, but what comes after does matter. Cersei just faces absolutely no consequences for blowing up the set, and it's kind of like, what? That just does not make any sense. So again, like Jon's death in season 5, how we have this perfect scene, this great scene, it just gets completely undercut by just inconsistencies and conveniences that happen after.
The big woman's still here?
But now let's get into the really fun part of the video, the pointy end of the show, season 7 and 8. Season 7 of Game of Thrones, things really started to get a little bit rough. Seasons 5 and 6, they had their red flags, but season 7, things started to get really worrying. Season 7 felt like a rushed season, and there are several examples of that. Number 1, there were less episodes this season, which didn't give the show the time to breathe. So the pacing was just absolutely ridiculous. There was too much going on and it was happening way too quickly. And because there was less episodes, they had to throw the audience's suspension of disbelief out the window just to keep things moving. Like Dany going beyond the wall to save Jon and the crew in like 5 seconds. This show used to let characters take a handful of episodes, if not a season, to get from point A to point B. I know that she's on a dragon, but she gets there way too quickly, all while the dead just stand there because reasons. The ice broke, well, we'll just stand here, we'll wait for the Hound to throw a rock and then it'll be okay. The Night King could have legitimately just yeeted a spear at them that entire time, but just done absolutely nothing. I mean, I like this sequence, it's visually great and important for the story, but you need to throw logic out the window to really enjoy it. Not to mention Gendry running from where they were to the wall in like 5 seconds. Him passing out when he makes it to the wall doesn't excuse the fact that he would have had to run like the Flash to even try and make it. And the Night King killing and turning Viserion, cool idea, bad execution. In fact, really lazy execution. Season 7 just felt extremely messy overall. A lot happens in this season and it can be really entertaining, don't get me wrong. But I swear more happens in this season than the previous 3 seasons combined. And it does it with reduced episodes. So everything was just payoff without any real build up. Remember the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones? We spent so much time with these characters and built up to this perfected crescendo. That just never existed in the last 2 seasons. To prove my point, let's list off all of the major events of season 7. Arya destroys the Freys. Dany arrives at Dragonstone. Jon meets Dany. Dany and Jon go beyond the wall to catch a White Walker. Jon and Dany come face to face with Cersei. Euron and his fleet attack Yara and Theon. We find out who really killed Joffrey. Dany yeets the Lannister army. Tyrion and Jaime reunite for the first time since Tywin's death. Cersei's pregnant. Uncle Benjen dies. Jon unites with Dany properly. The Night King kills and turns Viserion. Jon and Theon come face to face. Littlefinger dies. Jaime abandons Cersei. Confirmation that Jon is the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. So whilst editing this, I realized I completely forgot about the Night King yeeting the wall with Viserion and the undead crossing the wall, so that just kind of proves my point here even further. Anyway, back to the video. All of that and more happens in 8 freaking episodes. Like, what? This season showcases perfectly the fall of Game of Thrones. Don't get me wrong, nothing in season 7 is as insulting as what we see in season 8. But really? All of this in one season? Imagine if they did the 10 seasons like they had originally planned. And they gave the story the time to do all of this instead of condensing the most content out of any of the seasons by far into the shortest season so far at the time. And it's frustrating because the show still had its really outstanding moments, like Olena's final scene with Jaime. That was good shit, but everything around it just felt so messy and so rushed. I honestly feel like a lot of issues of Game of Thrones downfall start and end with D&D, the writers of the show, but some blame has to be thrown at the suits over at HBO for wanting the show to wrap up with shortened seasons and not enough seasons to tell the story that's been building for nearly a decade. But the time has come where we jump into season 8 of Game of Thrones. I don't think anybody watched season 8 of Game of Thrones and thought, not bad. I swear I've never in my life seen a show fall so hard on its face in its final season. The ease in which the most built-up moments of the show were just over and done with. The complete abandonment of character arcs, the plot armor, my God, the plot armor. I'll tell you one thing. Arya saved a lot of lives when she killed the Night King, but nothing saved more lives in the Battle of Winterfell than the editing did. Characters got swarmed by the undead. Whoop, better cut so we don't have to explain how they got out of that situation where death is literally guaranteed because, oh, look, they're fine now. Like, man, this is Game of Thrones, the show where plot armor was a no-no. Now it's absolutely everywhere. And that was something that I constantly had to say to myself when watching season 8 again. Like, this is Game of Thrones now. This is the final season of what was once the best TV show in the world. I've got to say, I absolutely love the cast reactions to season 8 of Game of Thrones, as it basically sums it all up.
Have you shot your final scenes yet? And are you happy with how things ended?
Yeah. How do you feel about the way that it ends?
There are no better writers in television than Dan Weiss and David Benioff.
Exactly.
Character development.
Lob it all
Story.
in. I really need to shut up.
You're brave.
Oh my God.
If you could describe the season finale of Game of Thrones in one word, how would you describe that?
Disappointing.
Now let's be brutally honest, season 8 of Game of Thrones was doomed before it even started. The fact this season has 6 episodes, yet it has the most to do, is simply baffling to me. Whoever made the decision to have the final season of Game of Thrones be 6 episodes long.
Dumb cunt.
Now I already went on about how season 7 tried to do too much in a shorter season, so I won't repeat that as we have enough to get to with season 8 as it is. But come on, man, 6 episodes. I'll forget about it. Moving on. So I want to talk about character reunions in this season, more so Arya and Jon, and of course Bran and Jaime as well. These should have been some of the coolest moments of the show. Arya and Jon were genuinely close in season 1, so seeing them together again in season 8 is a really special moment. But it's just like hug, sword, done. That's the reunion. And now this isn't really a reunion, but Jaime and Bran coming face to face for the first time since season 1 as well. This is an awkward as hell moment, but it's completely undercut because Bran might as well just be a tree at this point. Now, as for Jon finding out about who he really is, I actually thought this was great. I like that it was Sam that told him. What I don't like is when he goes to tell Arya and Sansa, we don't get to see their reaction. It just cuts away like cheers for the blue balls. And while we're on the topic of Jon, let's talk about season 8 Jon. If I was Kit Harington, I would have been fuming with the way Jon was handled this season. It's not his fault in the slightest. His response to literally anything is just,
I don't want it. I told you I don't want it. I never wanted a crown. You are my queen. You are my queen. You are my queen. Daenerys is our queen. She is our queen. She'll be a good queen. She is my queen.
Jon's lineage opened up so many amazing possibilities for storytelling, but it just gets completely wasted because the writers turned Jon into a complete donut. And the scene where Jon doesn't say goodbye to Ghost pisses me off so much. I know that it was a budget thing, but come on, you're Game of Thrones. Don't give me that shit. But oh boy, we are just warming up with season 8. Let's talk about the Battle of fucking Winterfell. This, in my opinion, could have and probably should have been the best episode in Game of Thrones history. but it was one of the most underwhelming, frustrating, devoid of logic episodes of television I have ever seen. I've already spoken about the plot armor, so I'm not going to repeat that again. The production design for this episode is like so uneven. In some areas, what's on screen is simply top notch. And then we have complete darkness and at times just complete and utter visual noise. That's the lesser of this episode's issues though, and Peter Dinklage summed it up beautifully.
We're in a crypt. Nobody thought of that. He's bringing all the dead people back to life, and they put the women and children in a crypt with all the dead people. So, rah.
Like, imagine in the real world, a zombie apocalypse has just broken out and you need to find a place of refuge and someone says, let's go to a cemetery. That's the logic that Game of Thrones has in this season. That's what happens. It's mind-blowing that Game of Thrones was able to stoop this low in just common sense. The Dothraki charge the undead despite Jon saying that they can't beat them in a straight fight. Like, are you dumb? And Jesus, let's talk about the Night King. The Night King is such a cool villain because he's not really even a villain at this point. He's more of a force of nature. And there was all this build up for Jon to take on the Night King, but they never even fight. This episode would have bumped up a notch if Jon and the Night King at least fought. And it just would have been the cherry on top if Jon killed him, because that's pretty much what was being set up. Arya killing the Night King is not a satisfying conclusion, and D&D saying that Arya killing the Night King just felt right? It's just like, what? They try and justify it by having Melisandre say she's going to shut Blue Eyes. Like, come on, does anyone want Arya appearing out of the shadows to Rey the Last Jedi the Night King? No, nobody wanted that. People wanted to see Jon and the Night King duke it out because that's what you've been setting up. From the second they laid eyes on each other at Hardhome, that's what people wanted to see. But nope, Jon just has to yell at Viserion whilst Arya does what they set Jon up to do. So the Battle of Winterfell.
Disappointing.
The Night King.
Disappointing.
It's just crazy how much they completely bottled this. And also the symbol that they've been setting up throughout the entire show in regards to the Night King. We still don't know by the show's conclusion what it all means. It's funny because the writers openly admitted that they had no clue what the symbols really meant. But yet, despite that, they were still happily including them in the show anyway. Like, come on, man. But that's the Night King done with, so that sucked. But somehow the following episode, which showed the aftermath of the Battle of Winterfell, Starbucks cups aside, was even worse than the Battle of Winterfell. Jon's speech at the funeral ceremony it makes me laugh because he just pulls a quill from Infinity War. As for Jaime and Brienne going to Pound Town, it was just awkward. Like, I like Jaime and Brienne, they always had this really cool back and forth dynamic, but there was no romantic relationship there brewing at all. You cannot change my mind. It was just super awkward, and to be honest, it was really hard to watch. And then Euron Greyjoy just turns into the most elite sniper and scorpions Rhaegal multiple times, so Rhaegal is dead now. But then they have Drogon just fly through the Iron Fleet anyway, despite Drogon being a bigger target than Rhaegal and being closer. They can't hit Drogon. Like, come on, man. At least try to make this convincing. And the fact that they just justified this entire thing even happening because Dany forgot about the Iron Fleet. Dany was literally just told about this.
Well, Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces.
And the Golden Company has arrived in King's Landing, courtesy of the Greyjoy fleet.
Are you yawning in the middle of this while I'm breaking it down? Huh?
And I mean, Tyrion and Varys just become straight up stupid in this season, and then Jaime just leaves Brienne and runs back to Cersei. Like, what is even going on anymore? When this actually first happened, I thought maybe Jaime was going to go back to King's Landing and kill Cersei, as he has the best chance of getting to her out of anyone. And I mean, he stabbed the Mad King in the back. Now it's Cersei's turn, but nope. D&D just flipped the reset switch on his character development. And then Dany and Cersei come face to face on the outskirts of King's Landing, and Missandei dies, which sends Dany mad. And I just want to say, why did Cersei not kill Tyrion here? Like, what is stopping her from calling off those archers? And don't say because Drogon's sitting there. They have scorpions on the wall. Hitting Rhaegal was no problem as he was a moving target and a million miles away. Drogon is just sitting there. They could just shoot him. Now, I know some people are going to say maybe Cersei doesn't hate Tyrion as much as she leads on because she spared his life a couple times. Like, I'd like that, but I'm just not willing to give the writers the credit for actually thinking of it. But now let's talk about the Bells episode. First off, the complete and utter character assassination of this episode, as it's probably the worst Game of Thrones episode in terms of this. Jaime Lannister, just behind Tyrion as my favorite character in the show, gets completely destroyed in this episode. The scene in the tent with Tyrion, it has a nice moment, but it's ultimately overshadowed by the most incompetent writing I have ever seen.
If your precious Randy commanded you to kill your own father and stand by while thousands of men, women and children burned alive, would you have done it?
And for every one of the million people in that city, innocent or otherwise.
To be honest, I never really cared much for them. Innocent or otherwise.
Fuck off.
Jaime killed the Mad King to avoid the very thing he legitimately says in this scene that he apparently just doesn't care about. This was definitely bring your kid to work day for the writers. Like, their kids just got onto Final Draft and just started typing stupid shit, and D&D just left it there. That is the only logical explanation for this scene. And then Jaime just goes and gets in a fight with Euron, despite this being the biggest load of crap that Euron just happens to be there at that exact time, and then he just dies with the most cringe line ever.
I'm the man who killed Jaime Lannister.
Fuck off.
Euron in this show is absolutely awful. I don't know why they went the angle that they did with him. It wasn't funny. It was just annoying. Anyway, though, Jaime runs back to Cersei, puts a bow on the pile of dog shit that is now his character development, and gets crushed by rocks in Cersei's arms. Are you kidding me? Now, the Mad Queen arc hitting its climax. Look, the Mad Queen arc, I just want to say I am completely down for the Mad Queen arc. I know some people are completely against it. They just can't justify Dany doing what she did. But the Mad Queen arc in concept is actually a brilliant arc for Dany. The problem lies within the execution. The show simply did not have enough time to flesh this arc out, and the way it was handled was absolutely god-awful. Like, King's Landing has surrendered. There is no inciting incident after the surrender that makes Dany snap. If you wanted to do that, maybe have Cersei kill Missandei in the Red Keep right in front of Dany while she's floating there on Drogon or something. So that way, when Missandei says Dracarys and then dies, that can be the thing that makes Dany snap. You can't just ring the bells, which apparently means the city has surrendered, despite Davos saying in season 2 that bells don't mean surrender, but anyway. Then Dany just goes apeshit after the city is surrendered, like she has won, but she just murders like 1 million people. I'd understand burning the Red Keep to the ground after the city surrenders, that I could justify, but this? No. Just no. And Cersei, a key antagonist of the show since it first started, just stands in the Red Keep looking out the window. That's all she does. This season, she bitches about elephants, looks out the window, and dies. That's Cersei in season 8. I will say though, on a positive note, Clegane Bowl, that wasn't bad. I didn't mind that. But overall, the Bells is a complete disaster. But the Iron Throne was the final episode of Game of Thrones and possibly the worst episode of Game of Thrones. When we talk about the rise and fall of Game of Thrones, this is where the final plummet just went straight down. After like half an hour of characters slowly walking through destruction, we finally get to Dany giving a speech very reminiscent of a certain someone. Tyrion says, "Nah bitch, you're clapped," and throws his Hand of the Queen pin away. And then Jon just continues to be a complete and utter dumbass. The scene where Dany walks up to the Iron Throne mirrors the scene that we saw earlier in the show, which was pretty cool. That was actually a pretty nice touch. And the cinematography in this scene, like, my god. The cinematography in this episode in general is actually incredible, but it just does not make up for the garbage. So then Jon just goes and says the line for the 100th time this season.
You are my queen.
And then he kills Dany, Drogon shows up, lets Jon live, burns the Iron Throne to the ground, and flies off with Dany. This entire scene is just such a letdown. It all came down to execution, and whilst it looked great visually, it just doesn't work. And then when they try and wrap the show up, Tyrion gives a speech in handcuffs and suggests that Bran be king, and then Bran becomes king. At this point, it's just like, whatever, can we please just end this? Sansa could have legit said who Jon was and he could have been king. And I mean, if he's king, they're probably not going to put him into exile at the Night's Watch. Like, think about that for a second. Sansa says, I wish there was another way, in a scene towards the end of the show, when there was literally another way. I know that Jon just would have said, I don't want it, or something like that, but it's better than Bran. So then Jon gets banished to the Night's Watch to live out his days, Tyrion corrects some chairs, and that's it. That's Game of Thrones. So many loose ends, so many unanswered questions, a really frustrating conclusion, to put it lightly. All in all though, Game of Thrones is a masterpiece and a complete disaster. The first half of this show is the pinnacle of television, and the second half, but more so the final season, is a complete and utter dumpster fire. Having said that, I still enjoyed my rewatch, and I probably will watch the show again. But all in all, that is the rise and fall of Game of Thrones. But guys, let me know your thoughts on Game of Thrones in the comments below. Are you excited for House of the Dragon? If you made it this far into the video, type McQueen in the comments. I'll know you're a real one. Subscribe for more videos like this, and take care.